Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So we are going to be doing a video where I'm just going to be talking about all the loose powders that I covered over Loose Powder Week, along with some other powders that I use and love, and kind of just talk about everything that I kind of know about loose powders now that I've kind of gone through this process, and how I like to apply them, what powders I like to use for what. I am by no means a loose powder expert. I just recently fell down this rabbit hole. I have very, very dry skin. It's very, very sensitive. So I have always shied away from loose powders, but I don't know exactly what kind of pushed me down into this rabbit hole. But into the rabbit hole I fell, and I've come across some really, really great loose powders. I feel like the loose powder game has really, really improved over the past, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like, when was the last time I really tried loose powders, because there is something very glamorous about loose powder. There's always that powder puff. It always comes in this gigantic container, and it's something you always see like old Hollywood divas use, they puff their entire face. So loose powder to me has always been like one of those products that I've always really wanted to use, yet has never really worked out for me. So I think between a combination of just better products out on the market, my willingness to kind of play around with them, along with having tools that I think really work well with these powders, I think that trifecta is really what has pushed me to kind of really play around and explore loose powders a little bit more. So I think I'm going to talk about loose powders in terms of two things: setting powder and finishing powder. And I want to talk about the benefits of using a setting powder and the benefits of using a finishing powder. I want to talk about which powders I think are better setting powders, which ones are better finishing powders, and then I want to talk about the application for each as well. So let's start with setting powder. I know a lot of people, including myself, who have dry skin, who have always shied away from setting powder because they think that it dries out their skin even more, or it makes their skin appear dry. Now, first of all, I should say anything I'm saying in this video is not a rule, I'm not a makeup artist. These are just my experiences, and I just want to share with you some of my thoughts, but I really welcome your comments. I really like let's talk this out. Like if I say something that you don't agree with or whatever, let's hear it. I want to I learn a lot from you guys. So I really want to open up this discussion. I almost wish we could have like a web conference with like everyone kind of chiming in. But anyway, we'll do that in the comment section. And so setting powder. So setting powder does just that. It like sets your makeup. So for me, I tend to gravitate towards makeup that is, because I have dry skin, makeup that is, or foundation I should say, that is very emollient, that is very nourishing, that is very moisturizing, that is very radiant. And foundations like that tend to need to be set. If they're not set, what happens is they basically remain wet, let's say. They basically remain as is on your skin, where they don't actually set down ever. Matte foundations pretty much set, and if I were to put on a matte foundation, I probably wouldn't use setting powder for my skin. Now, if you have oily skin, you would probably use a setting powder all the time, because your oils would start to break away at any foundation, whether it was a radiant foundation or a matte foundation, and you would want to set that down. And I'm coming from the perspective of just an everyday person going about their everyday lives. I'm not talking about editorial work. I'm not talking about if you're working on a photo shoot, if you're working on a TV set. The rules completely change in terms of that. So I'm just talking about everyday wear. And so for me, when I don't use a setting powder and I have very radiant foundation down, or foundation that is very moisturizing, and it kind of remains wet, what happens is it transfers all day. It transfers to my phone, it transfers to my hand when I do this, and it'll just, I don't want to make it sound like it's just this slime on your face, but it really will kind of come off of your face much more quickly than if you were to set it down. So that's one reason why I like to use setting powder over foundation. The other reason why I like to use setting powder over foundation is it gives your skin a nice canvas to apply other products. So if you have, let's say, a radiant foundation and you think it's set down enough, maybe you don't want to go the setting powder route, maybe it only feels like just ever so slightly tacky, what will happen is if you use a powder product on top of that, like a bronzer or a blush, it may actually catch onto your foundation if you didn't smooth it over with a setting powder. So you may end up with patchy blush, you may end up with patchy bronzer or highlight or any other powder product that you put down if you don't set it down first. And so that's another reason why I like to put down setting powder, is because then any other powder product that I put on top of it really applies very, very smoothly. And I hope that makes sense. I'm thinking you can probably visualize that. If you're going to apply, pigmented powder on top of something that's a little bit tacky, it's going to catch a little bit. So that's another reason why I like to use setting powder. And one reason I learned, it's like I've heard people talk about this, yet I never thought, even though I never really tried it, I never thought that it would actually make that big of a difference. But I have always had problems with any kind of pencil eyeliner staying put, either in the waterline or just along my lash line or whatever on my actual eyelids. No matter what, by the end of the day, I would kind of have a panda effect. Some liners better than others, but I would always have at least a little bit of smudging. Ever since, and this started with Loose Powder Week, ever since I started using loose powders to set and finish my makeup, I have had a very noticeable difference in terms of eyeliner transfer. And I think because if you're using setting powder, it's really removing any sort of moisture and emollients away from that area so there's no smearing. And then once you finish it, if you do finish around your eye area, it's really going to kind of set that eyeliner down. So I've had great luck using loose powder both for setting and finishing in terms of keeping my eyeliner in place. So many years ago, I purchased some loose powders, including the La Mer loose powder, that original loose powder that you saw in my last Loose Powder Week video. And I never really had too much luck with them. And what I discovered, and this is probably common sense to most of you out there, but I can be a little bit thick, is that I was always using way too much, just way too much powder. It takes the tiniest amount of powder, of setting powder, to set down your makeup. You really don't need that much. So if you have dry skin and your concern is, it always makes my skin look dry, I can never use it, but I would like to, I would say use less than what you have been using, use less than what you think you should be using, and also maybe change up your powder, because I have definitely noticed some powders are much more drying looking than others, even if they're all the same finish. So definitely I think for dry skin and someone who doesn't necessarily like an overly matte finish, when it comes to setting powder, less is more. So setting powder in terms of application, you guys saw me kind of play around with a few different brushes in the beginning of Loose Powder Week, and then I just started to use one because it ended up being my favorite, and that is the xoxo Z1 brush. This is not, I would say, a terribly easy brush to get a hold of. I believe this has been out of stock on Beautylish for many weeks, possibly months. And so I purchased mine off of cdjapan.co.jp. It is a Japanese site, and they sell makeup brushes along with a lot of other kind of random things. It's a very interesting site. I will link to it down below. But that's where I purchased this along with some other xoxo brushes. But the reason why I like this brush is because, one, it's not so big, so I feel like I have at least a little bit of control as to where exactly the powder is going. Because again, I feel like less is more when it comes to setting powder. I don't want to just, kind of blindly and willy-nilly just, use a gigantic brush and kind of just brush it all over my face when that's not exactly the effect that I want. I like to focus the setting powder very lightly around my eyes, because concealer is known to crease, and once you set it down, it does a lot less movement. You'll see a lot less creasing, you'll see a lot less fading throughout the day, and that is really so that I can get my blush, bronzer, and highlight down very smoothly. So I just focus it right here If I feel like I'm having maybe a little bit of an oily day, my nose area gets a little bit oily, I'll press it there a little bit, and then I'll brush it just lightly over my forehead. But I don't think I need it everywhere per se. I don't feel like I need it along my jawline necessarily. I just like to brush it kind of around the cheek area, but I really like to focus it where I'm gonna need the setting powder. If I'm wearing a very emollient foundation, like the Clé de Peau The Foundation, which is like, it literally is just like moisturizer for your face, I will put powder down all over. But if I'm wearing something like the Kogendo Aqua Foundation, which actually has like a powder technology in there, I don't feel like I need to powder my whole face. I'll powder kind of strategically. And what I like to do when it comes to setting powder, because the difference between setting powder and finishing powder generally is when you're applying setting powder, you're applying it over wet, liquid, or cream products. Where finishing powder, you're applying powder over powder. It becomes a little less tenuous when you're using finishing powder because you can just buff, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when it comes to setting powder, because you are putting it on top of cream and liquid products, you don't want those products to move. And I have used brushes in the past where I'll put the setting powder down, even if I'm touching it ever so slightly, and I'll look at my brush and I'll see that I ended up with foundation on my brush. And for me, I don't like that. I feel like then I am moving the product around. So what I like to do is when I'm using a setting powder, I like to use this particular brush, the Chikuhodo Z1. This is squirrel hair. So squirrel hair is very, very soft, and because it's very, very soft, it doesn't actually pick up a lot of product. It can't physically pick up a lot of product because it is very, very soft, but it blends very, very well. So for me, this is kind of like a check for me. Like it's difficult to pick up too much product with a squirrel hair brush. Even if I dip it right in, I'll see that I have a lot, but as soon as I try and knock it off, it comes right off. It blows off very, very easily. So I like that brush for this. I've explained also why I like the smaller size, because I like to strategically place it. And so what I'll do with this brush, and I like the shape of it, the dome shape, is that I will press it into my skin. And I think you guys saw that during my loose powder week, that I would pounce it on my skin before actually doing any sweeping motions, because I wanted to get the powder down first. And that I feel like ensures that I'm not going to be actually moving any of the product down. So I'll press it around my eyes. I'll probably grab a little bit more powder, and then I'll press it onto where I want to apply it. And then because squirrel hair is so soft, it is meant to be used with, like, again, this is my experience, I'm not a brush expert, but I feel like squirrel hair is meant to be used in a sweeping motion. And that's another reason why I like using this brush for setting powder, because what I'm doing is I'm pouncing all this powder on, and then what I want to do is sweep away any of the excess. I don't want to continuously be working in too much of the setting powder, because that's when I feel like I have too much of it. That's when I feel like I start to get very, very cakey. So for me, this was like the perfect brush. Now, if I'm using a powder where I don't feel like it's possible to get cakey, I'm maybe applying it all over my face, I'm really not applying it strategically, I'll use something like the La Mer brush, which is much bigger. It's synthetic fiber. It's going to pick up maybe a little bit more than the squirrel hair. You can even feel it. You know, when you like kind of roll your fingers over the brush, you'll feel it kind of grabbing onto your skin, and I can feel that the squirrel hair is a lot less grippy than the La Mer brush. So this is when I don't mind a slightly heavier application. I also don't mind that it's big. I'm not kind of strategically placing the powder. So that's when I'll grab this brush. Another synthetic hair option that I like is the Hourglass powder brush. This one has longer bristles, which I think is nice for that sweeping motion. But this has a bit of a heavier hand than this. So this I'll have a bit of a heavier application when it comes to powder application. So again, this I only use if I'm sure I'm using a powder where I don't really care if the application is a little bit thicker than the average. And the other natural haired brush that I like, this is the Surratt powder brush. And you can see that it's a little bit less fluffy than the Chikuhodo. You can also see that the bristle is a little bit longer. So the Chikuhodo I'll pounce and I'll kind of like sweep away. This I will use if I feel like I kind of pull this brush out. If I feel like I put way too much powder down, you know, you can tell. You look in the mirror and you're like, oh my God, like what just happened? Because this, I feel like, even though this is squirrel hair as well, because of the shape, it has a stronger action to it. And so let's say I maybe put too much under my eyes and my under eye is starting to look a little dry. I'll take this brush and I'll really kind of like sweep away as much powder as possible. But this has a stronger kind of like sweeping action. It's not quite as like light and fluffy as the Chikuhodo. So that's how I like to apply setting powder, and this is the brush that I like. Now let's talk about which powders I liked as setting powder. So personally, I do not like setting powders that have any sparkle to them, because to me, what I'm doing is simply setting down my makeup. I'm preparing my face for other makeup, and I don't want anything to kind of interfere with my other makeup. So I don't want to use a powder that has too much sparkle in there. If, let's say, I'm going to be using, you know, a matte bronzer and a matte blush, but yet I have all this sparkle going on. So for me, a matte powder gives me a lot more options for the makeup that I'm going to be applying later on. I can then sparkle it up with like highlighter, or I can sparkle it up with finishing powder. So that's first and foremost for me, that I personally like matte powders. Now, if you feel like you are always going to shimmer, you always want to shimmer, you are never ever going to have a matte look, I think the best powder in here that has a little bit of shimmer in there that worked as setting powder was the YSL. This I thought was a really, really beautiful setting powder. Despite its little sparkles in there, I thought it was really wonderful. It made my skin look very, very soft, and I really like the effect of it. The Sisley powder, which has a bit more sparkle to it, I thought was, it was a little bit too much. It's a powder that I like to buff. Without the buffing, I felt like it looked a little bit too thick and a little bit too heavy on my skin. And then I may as well mention the Meteorites, because I think these do make a nice setting powder. I much prefer them as a finishing powder. They do have sparkle in them, but I don't think they're actually detectable on the skin once you get the powder on. So you actually end up with kind of like a pearly satin finish. So if you're into that, these are the two that I would recommend, the YSL and the Guerlain Meteorites. Now, my favorite setting powder, like I'd mentioned, are the matte ones, and the Clé de Peau is still by far my favorite loose setting powder. I think it does a great job blurring, which is another thing I look for in setting powders. I want it to blur. I don't want it to change the color of my complexion too much. This one brightens my complexion a bit. It does have like a very, very slight pink tint to it, but I like it for my skin tone. It's matte, but it's not 1000% matte. You know, it's just, there's like a little bit of something in there that kind of gives your skin a little bit of a pearly finish. So this one is definitely my favorite setting powder. A very, very close second is the Chanel. This was one that you guys recommended to me. And this is another one where they describe it as matte, but it really is much more of a natural finish. So it's not too drying looking. It doesn't just look like you're completely devoid of any moisture. It's a really, really lovely powder. I don't think it has quite the blurring effect that the Clé de Peau does. But other than that, I think it sets down your makeup beautifully. I think the finish is really, really lovely. Again, natural without being too drying. Yeah, and I love this. And I think tied as a runner-up to the Clé de Peau is definitely the Chantecaille. This one is a little bit more, or becomes a little bit more radiant. This powder was the one that I thought was so interesting because it evolved during the day. And it's not like it just broke down and I started to look oily. The powder actually started to look like a little bit of a highlight on my skin. It really kind of came into its own and started to look very, very beautiful on my skin. So I think this is a really, really great option for people with dry skin who don't want to appear dry, but you also don't want to appear like glittery in any way. This just has a really beautiful, lovely, lovely sheen. And it's also worth mentioning that this is talc free. So if any of you are sensitive to talc, this is an excellent option. So finishing powder. Let's talk about finishing powder. I like to use finishing powder to give my overall appearance a finish. Whether that finish is one that's brighter, one that's more radiant, one that has like a pearly sheen, one that's like a little bit glittery, one that's like a little bit sparkly. That's one reason why I like to use finishing powder. The other reason why I like to use it now is to blend and to soften up all of the products I just put on my face. All the bronzer, blush, highlight, contour, whatever it is. So you have all these products on your face, and for me, it's nice to take one product and kind of buff it over all of those areas, and it just sort of blends, especially your cheeks. It just sort of blends everything really nicely. Or if you apply bronzer, maybe it looks a little bit patchy. You know, if you take your finishing powder and a brush and you kind of buff it all out, you can really kind of blend it out and really make everything look really airbrushed and soft. So I like to use a finishing powder to do that as well. So for me, the only brush I like to use for finishing powder is the Sonia G Face One brush. I feel like any of the other brushes I have in my collection are either too effective or not effective enough. So I have some brushes where I've gone in and I've buffed, and all of a sudden I've just buffed everything away. Like I don't have any more bronzer, I don't have any more blush. Everything has just turned into kind of like a muddy mess, and it's a mess. Or I have brushes that are too soft, that are much better for setting powders, and when I try and buff, they don't really do anything. There's no blending. It doesn't really work the product into my skin. So I had mentioned with setting powder that I like to kind of set it down and then just sort of swipe away any sort of excess. With finishing powder, I really like to make sure I buff it into the skin, and I think that's what makes a finishing powder really, really shine. The Sonia G Face One brush, it may look like a typical kabuki brush, but it's just not as dense. I mean, the bristles are as firm, but it's not as dense. It has a little bit more give, and I just think it works as a buffer so nicely. It's just the perfect amount of firmness, but it's also soft at the same time, so it's effective, but it's not too effective. It's just, to me, this is just the perfect brush. I have not been able to find any other brush that works for me quite as well as this one for finishing. So when it comes to the application of finishing powder, what I'll do is I'll just stick this brush right into the product, and then I'll just start buffing right away. I don't feel like I need to pounce or actually kind of lay the product down first. I'll just start buffing right away. So very, very easy to apply finishing powder, I think. So let's talk about my favorite finishing powders. So in terms of finishing powder, this is a powder you definitely don't need to put down everywhere. I like to put it down on my cheeks, again, to kind of blend out my bronzer and blush. I like to put it down on my forehead, and maybe I'll put it down in areas where I want to give this like nice finishing effect, like a glow or something. So I'll put it where I would highlight, like the bridge of my nose, tops of my cheeks, center of my forehead, chin, all of that area. But I won't just go over everything with my finishing powder. And that's another reason why I like this brush, because it's not that big. Let me just hold it up. This is how big it is next to the La Mer. So great size if you want to buff strategically. So my favorite finishing powder at the moment is the Guerlain Meteorites. I've mentioned these so much in like the past few videos I've done, so I'm sorry if I'm like just being annoyingly repetitive, but I have medium, I have Doré, which is part of their regular line. So I use the Doré around like my bronzer blush area, because that's like a deeper shade, and probably around like the perimeter of my forehead. I'll do that sometimes, and then I'll take the medium and put anywhere else, and then I'll use the limited edition gold one, and I'll put that where I highlight. So I'll put it on my cheeks and like the bridge of my nose, and I've just been loving it. The Meteorites, even though it looks glittery in the canister, really doesn't translate to the skin. You're just left with a really beautiful pearly finish, and I just love it. And I've come to love the fragrance of them. It's that violet fragrance, which dissipates very quickly. It's not like I can actually smell it on my skin, but every time I open up the canister, it's just such a lovely experience. So I've been loving that. Runner up to that is probably the Sicily powder. Even though this has little sparkles in there, I don't mind that for a finishing powder so much. It really leaves my skin looking glowy and youthful, and you know, all those wonderful things. And it does a great like smoothing, blurring effect also. I want to say that the finish of the Sicily powder is like a little bit bumped up from the Meteorites. It's a little bit more glowy than the Meteorites. I also love the YSL for finishing. This does have also a nice glow, but I don't think it's as much as the Meteorites, and also not as much as the Sicily, but it just gives you a nice glow, and it has just just a hint of those sparkles. So I think it's a really nice alternative if maybe you're not into anything that's too kind of pearly or too kind of glowy. This is much more of like a natural kind of glow. And then I think if you're into something 100% natural, you don't want any kind of glow, glitter, pearly finish, you just want your skin to look like skin, I would say the Chanel or the Chantecaille. The Chanel more so, the Chantecaille probably has like a little bit more glow to it, but the Chanel will be your friend. If you just want your skin to look like skin, I think this is the guy for you. So that is it for this loose powder roundup summary video. I hope you found that helpful. Again, I'm not a makeup artist. What I say is not end all be all. You may hate the powders that I really love, or you may love the powders that I don't really like, but let's get this conversation started. Definitely comment down below with what your favorite loose powders are, how you use them, your experience with loose powders, and if you have dry skin and you have, more questions about loose powders and how they work for me, because I haven't found any of the powders that I like to use, I haven't found them making my skin look dry at all. So anyway, I look forward to hearing from you guys. Subscribe if you haven't already. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in my next video.